I miss Game of Thrones. For a good while, it was my favorite show on television. The characters, the setting, the performances, it was all just so incredibly engaging. There was this really cool thing about the show where you would be in a scene with a character and it would get to the end of it and jump to the next. And for a second, you'd be like, oh no, I wanted to stay with them forever. And then by the end of the new scene, you'd be like, oh no, I wanted to stay with this character forever. There's always going to be something interesting with any character that's being followed. And that's especially impressive because it has a massive ensemble cast. Like most shows struggle to make one likable character, but Game of Thrones managed to have 20. And obviously a big part of this is due to the writing of George R.R. Martin. And what's incredible is A Song of Ice and Fire is not an easy series to adapt. Its scope is just so huge, and the things that exist within the world are, frankly, in a lot of cases, impossible. So trying to make this into a television show for people to follow seems like a terrible idea, but D.B. Weiss and David Benioff found a way to do it. They adapted the unadaptable, and it kind of revolutionized television. As far as how I got into the series, I actually watched the first episode the day it came out. My brother was a big fan of the book, so I had some familiarity with it, and I was just looking for something to watch and figured I'd give it a shot. I found the first episode to be enjoyable, but I didn't necessarily feel hooked throughout. That is until the very end when this happens.
The things I do for love.
After that, I knew I had to read these books, so I went out and bought the first one and had read it before the second episode came out. I fell deeply in love with the series at that point, and for the next few years, it was something I constantly thought about. And now that the show has been over for a good while, I find myself missing it a lot. Of course, the response to me saying I miss it for some of you might be, Raz, hey, the show still exists, you can go watch it. But we all know that that is not really possible, at least not in the way I want it to be possible. And that really comes down to two big reasons. The first and most obvious reason is that the show got bad, like really bad. Its 8th season was abysmal. It is one of the most disappointing finales ever. And, obviously I think if you compare it to average TV, it might actually be better than a fair amount of average TV. But this was Game of Thrones. This was the leader of peak TV. So for it to dive down to a much lower standard that didn't feel so thought out, that didn't really follow thematically with everything that came before, was a huge disappointment. By the end, it felt like a cheap imitation of Game of Thrones. And of course, some people will say that it was really only the 8th season that was bad, but the 7th season is not much better. The characters become invincible heroes with the stupidest plans ever instead of fragile geniuses, which is what the show was built on. Of really smart characters who have to maneuver in clever ways as to not die. But in 7, they can make the stupidest plans ever and just still be okay. For me personally though, I think the show started to go downhill at the end of season 4. This seems to be the part of the series where David and Dan decided they were going to start wrapping things up. And I will be forever curious to fully understand what went on behind the scenes to lead them to this point. I know everyone points to them getting a Star Wars trilogy as the reason that they wanted to move away from Game of Thrones, and while I'm sure that is part of it, I think there must be a reason as to why they would pursue a different trilogy for a major thing while running the biggest and best show ever made. It is worth noting that it's hard to make a long-running TV show, especially one like this, so my guess is at the start of it, they never expected to even get to 8 seasons. They probably didn't expect to get to 4, but once they had, HBO knew it was a hit, and they would keep producing it for as long as they could because it made them tons of money and kept them relevant. So there must have been more to David and Dan's decision. I've heard before that their main goal was just to adapt The Red Wedding, and I guess at this point they had gotten there and passed it, and maybe that was it, but they obviously stuck with the show way longer than that, so you think they would just pass it off if they simply wanted to do that and be done. My suspicion is that they thought the books would be farther along by the time they got to that point. The first 3 books make up the first 4 seasons. Game of Thrones is season 1, A Clash of Kings is season 2, and A Storm of Swords is seasons 3 and 4. And obviously they cut things here and there and simplify other things to make it a smoother story for television, but for the most part they get the major beats in a way that feels satisfying and mostly follows what George R.R. Martin set out out to do. And when talking about this, a lot of people say that David and Dan caught up to the books, but that's not really true, because the 5th season truncates the 4th and 5th books and shoves it all into one package. When you look at the amount of pages that these books make up, they probably would have been about 3 seasons worth of material. So the fact that it all made it into one means that most of it was cut. And I will say the 4th and 5th books are an interesting beast, because in the 3rd one, a lot of characters die. So Martin's solution to this was to introduce new characters and to elevate older ones to become more important parts of the story. And this certainly has some issues. The 3rd book, Storm of Swords, was just so perfectly paced and filled with constant action, so the transition to Feast for Crows feels a little jarring because things get so much slower. And a lot happens, but it's not the same kind of stuff we're used to happening. We're told to care about people we didn't really know much about before, and I think that is hard, especially on our first read through. One thing that's interesting is I've seen a lot of fans say that A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons were their 2 least favorite books on their first read through, but on subsequent ones they became 2 of their favorites. And I think that's because the characters in it and the stories told in it are important and interesting. It is just a little hard to adapt to them after the bombastic action of Storm of Swords. David and Dan, however, decided not to introduce most of the new characters that came up in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. Some of them sneak in there, but the arcs aren't the same and they really feel like pale imitations of what's in the books. They also killed some characters at this point who are still alive in the books and have a lot of things that they're doing in the books, which I do not and will never probably understand. The point is, the 5 books that are out right now could have easily been adapted into 8 seasons on their own. Now, this would have expanded the show out and made it an even bigger thing than it was before in terms of scope, which is a hard thing to do midway through. And also, it still comes with the problem of them having to switch from adapters to creators. Because even after 8 seasons, which is when the show ended in 2019, George R.R. Martin had not released the 6th book, Winds of Winter. The book is still not out today, although there are rumblings that it might be coming out soon, and yes, I am delusional. Yes, I am delusional. Yes, I am delusional. I bet you Doors of Stone is also going to get announced like next week. Okay, never mind. Anyway, at a point, they would have to catch up to the source material. And sure, I've heard George R.R. Martin gave them notes on the big plans of what he's doing, and that they actually used some of those ideas in the show, although it doesn't get to them in the same way, and it sounds like they also twisted them in a way that isn't what George intended. It's hard to know what's really true. There's a lot of articles that go around of George throwing slight shade and like his manager or agent or something throwing shade. I don't know what's all true, but it sounds like George gave them an outline and they used some of it. His involvement with the show pretty much stopped after season 4. Apparently he wanted to step away from writing episodes so that he could focus on Winds of Winter and other projects. However, even though he planned to step away, he still wanted to be involved to some degree, but David and Dan seemingly kept him at a distance and didn't really ask for his input anymore, which I think shows. The point of it is, at some point, the show was going to catch up with the books because George R.R. Martin is taking his time writing. And I think that's fine. I think he should live the life he wants to live and tell the stories he wants to tell. And he doesn't owe me anything, I guess. Yeah, I guess. But obviously, it's going to create problems for the people who are making a show based around his books. You can say, oh, well, the 2 of them had the outline for what George was going to do, but that's different than working off existing material. It calls them to create a whole lot more and to figure out how things will actually feel on the page. And clearly, that's something they struggled to do. They didn't know how to write most of their major characters, especially the very smart ones like Tyrion, Littlefinger, and Varys. And that's because it's hard to write smart characters. It takes a while, and I imagine that's part of why these books take George R.R. Martin so long to write. The whole point of Tyrion is that he can always think of the smart thing to do and say. George R.R. Martin has said before that the quips Tyrion thinks of on the fly are ones that take him weeks to think of. And I think this posed an issue for David and Dan, who now had to deal with these really smart characters while also running a show, and it just probably added more work to their plate than they expected to have to deal with. Adapting a show already is hard enough, but then you're asked to bring stuff to life based on just ideas, and it's way, way harder. I would imagine that they didn't want to expand the story even further and add even more characters to think about and worry about to then get to the point where they have to wrap wrap things up on their own anyway. And I think the fact that the books wouldn't be done anytime soon probably was becoming obvious around the 5th season, because George was getting involved in all sorts of projects, and anytime he was asked for an update on Winds of Winter throughout that time, he was always around the same page count and not making much progress. My point in this is not saying that David and Dan should be forgiven because George didn't finish the book. I think they did a messy job of it, and if they really didn't want to continue the show, they probably should have just handed it off to someone who did. Seemingly, a lot of the cast wanted to continue with these characters and see things through to a satisfying end, and also they were getting paid tons of money and becoming super famous, so it's like a gig that was great for them. I'm sure some were ready to end things, but I imagine most would have kept going for as long as they could have. And that probably would have been a while. According to George's estimates, the 6th and 7th book are probably going to be around the size of A Storm of Swords, which would mean between the two, that could probably be 4 seasons of show, if not more. So the version of the show that would match Martin's vision would be around 12 seasons. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of the cast and crew would love to be part of a show for that long, because it means that they're working for that long. Of course, I don't think things should just run as long as they can, but with a story like Game of Thrones that has a massive scope and so many branches with interesting stories, you can't just wrap it up quickly. For the show to really meet what the book is trying to do, it has to be long. And yeah, I feel a little mixed on this because, we only live for so long. Whatever you do as a creative person, you only have so many that you can do. Whether it be games you ship in your life, or TV shows you make, or YouTube videos you make. There's a limit. At a point, you won't be able to do these things anymore. Spending 12 years on something would be a huge part of David and Dan's working life. And it would mean that they'd be able to make less of other things that they might want to make and do. And that might be the best argument for them wanting to go off and make Star Wars instead of finishing Game of Thrones. Again, I do think they should have just passed off the reins if this is how they felt, but I do understand feeling that way. I really do wonder whether or not they would have stuck with the show had Martin actually finished the books in the time frame that he thought he might. Now, this whole ramble is to say that I can't ever go back to the time where the show was just good, where I didn't have to feel disappointed about this thing that was so great, kind of giving up on itself, becoming a shadow of what it once was, moving from a story where every conversation is layered and characters are saying things through subtext to each other and giving veiled threats, to ones where they just repeat the same lines over and over again, and their decision making doesn't really make any sense. It is harder to enjoy the first 4 seasons when I know what the last 4 seasons are like. And that's a bummer. I wish I could just separate it. I wish I could just stop after the 4th season and be like, that was a good show. Yeah, it ends there. But I can't, because the story doesn't end there. It doesn't come close to ending. From what Martin is working on, there is more story after Storm of Swords than there is before it. And yeah, it is hard for me to get over that. The show has just left me with so much baggage about how it ended up that it's just hard to enjoy in the same way. That's not to say I never enjoy going back to watch it. I do. I definitely go back to rewatch some of my favorite scenes, just some of my favorite lines, and it's enjoyable, but it's not the same feeling I had of wondering what it would be like to see these incredible moments from the book come to life. Really just speculating about the show, whether it be how they might adapt certain things or what might happen in general. I just really loved that. And this kind of leads into the second major reason I miss Game of Thrones, which is the experience of watching it as it came out was just such a joy. Each year for the roughly 2.5 months that the show would air, I looked forward to it every Sunday. It was something to have on my calendar that I knew I would get some value out of, and yeah, I just loved having that in my life. One of my closest friends got really into the show and books as well, and we would call each other after every episode and just talk for like 2 hours about what they did and what they might do in the future and how changing these little aspects might ripple out going forward. And yeah, it was just so much fun to speculate and to have this thing that people wanted to talk about. And not just my friends, it's like everyone wanted to talk about it. The show was such a hit. By the final season, it was averaging like 45 million viewers per episode. And before that, when I thought it was in its peak, it was still getting like 20 million. Like, my parents watched it, and they went on to read the books. These kinds of touchstones are pretty few and far between, and I don't know, there's something about them that I think is really great. I imagine some people might be cynical and say like, oh, you just want to like the popular thing, but it's not really about liking the popular thing. It's about everybody being interested in the same thing that I really enjoy. Maybe that sounds the same, but the point is I love talking to different people who I wouldn't expect to like Game of Thrones about how they like Game of Thrones and hearing what they like about it and the things that stand out most to them. Because right, I'm a loser. I'm a nerd. I make YouTube videos about video games. I'm the kind of guy who's supposed to like Game of Thrones. But to see my pretty normie friends who had never been interested in fantasy before pick up the books because of how much they love the show was amazing. I'm used to talking about things I like with certain groups of people, and I think it's special when you get those instances where it can extend beyond it. This is something I really liked about Animal Crossing New Horizons. There were just so many people I could talk to about this game. My wife wanted to play it a lot, and generally she only plays games because I ask her to, but this was a case where she just wanted to play it. Obviously, I don't think it'd be good if every property I liked got to be this popular, but it was nice to have Game of Thrones be a thing that got people into fantasy. And obviously there are downsides to this, as every show wants to be like Game of Thrones, so you get stuff like Avatar: The Last Airbender becoming this, which, okay. But yeah, for that time, it was just such an incredible community to engage with. And it was so fun to talk to people about the show and theorize about what would happen, and also have a little inside knowledge about what happens because I've read the books, and see what people who had only watched the show picked up on. And honestly, even when the show got bad, it was still fun to have so many people be interested in it, because I liked commiserating with others about where things went off the rails. It didn't solve anything. It was mostly complaining for the sake of complaining, but it was still fun to have a community of people who felt the same way I did and who wished that they didn't. And of course, time has passed. The show is no longer airing. There is no way to bring back that feeling of a new episode coming out every week and calling my friend right after it to talk about what happened, or to watch videos and listen to podcasts about theories of what was going on, because obviously it's done. The momentum is done. The show is over. It's impossible to bring that back. And yeah, I think that's a bummer. It's sad to know that this probably could have gone on for 12 whole seasons, and it could have probably been pretty decent for 12 whole seasons. And that would have been a nice world to live in, where it ended last year, right? That's about what it would have been. That would have been really cool. Obviously, that's not the world we live in, and that's okay. I'm sure I would have had complaints about that version of Game of Thrones too. But I liked being part of that wave. I liked having so many people to talk about this thing with that I really loved. And I like just having this thing to help distract me from the millions of things going on in life. In fact, it being on a Sunday was so huge for me for so long, as, you know, when I was in college, I would always have class on Mondays. And then when I started working before I did YouTube, I'd have work on Mondays, and you know, I'd get the Sunday scaries. I wouldn't really want to do those things. I'd get anxious about it. And to have that show to look forward to kind of made that transition a bit easier, because at least on Sunday I had Game of Thrones to watch. And I miss that, because I don't really have that now. I don't have something I'm as excited about, and I'm sure something will come up again. But these big cultural things, you know, they don't happen all the time. It takes time to establish. And of course, I know some people are probably saying, hey, you should watch House of the Dragon if you haven't. And I haven't. I probably should, because a big reason of why I loved Game of Thrones was watching it live. And if I just wait for House of the Dragon to be done, I'll lose that chance. It is hard to get excited about it in the same way because of how Game of Thrones ended. And it's also hard to get excited about it because of its nature as a prequel. I'm familiar with a lot of Fire and Blood, although I do know that things end up being different, but I generally do know the broad strokes of what happens. And, you know, obviously what's great about the show is the drama between the broad strokes, so there's still a lot to enjoy. But I do think a huge part of what I loved about watching Game of Thrones and reading the books, and what I still love about the books existing, is that there's so much to speculate on and so much to think about, and so many little prophecies and ideas to connect together to see what they might end up being. And there probably is some of that in House of the Dragon, but because it is a fixed thing, because I know what happens in the Dance with Dragons and I know what happens with the Targaryens, it just doesn't hit the same.
That doesn't mean it can't hit. It seems like a lot of people are really enjoying the show and are following it in a similar way to how they did with Game of Thrones, but it's just not the same kind of touchstone.
It is hard to know when a thing will become a thing, when something will become a cultural touchstone that is really fun to talk about with so many different kinds of people, because so many different kinds of people are engaging with it in a meaningful way. A lot of things that are super popular aren't all that deep because they're meaning to appeal to the lowest common denominator, but at least when Game of Thrones started, it very much was not that. It was niche and still somehow appealed to a massive audience. And I think that is so awesome, and I love when that sort of thing happens. I don't know when it will happen again. I don't know with what it will happen again. I think it will, and I hope that I'm in on it early enough to enjoy the long run of it. Getting to start Game of Thrones at the start and see how it grew was really cool, even when I started to hate it. So yeah, I miss Game of Thrones. I miss when it just aired and it was something to talk to other people about and to get excited about and to bond over. I miss when it had the potential to be one of the greatest shows of all time, and I miss when I got to watch it week after week and talk to all sorts of people about it. It was an impossibly special show. And even though I am mostly filled with disappointment when I think about it now, I do love it. And I hate it, but I do love it. And I'll keep holding out hope that we'll get something someday even more special. Although I don't think that thing will be Game of Thrones related. Even if they do Game of Thrones Brotherhood, it won't be nearly as big of a deal. And I don't know, how do you cast a better Tyrion than Peter Dinklage? How do you cast a better Ned Stark than Sean Bean? You don't. The answer is you don't. Mark Addy, my God. Robert, so good. Lena Headey, how does anyone do Cersei? How does anyone do her better? I don't know. Anyway, I'm sorry for wasting your time. Have a great day. Bye.